Hello, and welcome to Object 22 of 100 objects that tell the history and philosophy of Summerhill School. The object number 22 is this. Order, order. A gavel. This is a present from my auntie, who I said in an earlier episode was a science teacher, biology teacher all her life, and she's one of the reasons why I'm a lecturer and teacher now. As a young lad, she used to do water painting and take me for walks and inspire me with the natural world. Okay, so I have a number of stories to tell. One of the first stories really is about our court case. I think the only reason we won the court case, this is in 1999, 2000, and it's to do with the Ofsted inspection, HMI 1999, that resulted in a letter, basically a notice of complaint from the Department for Education that required us to do 6 different things in order to stay as a licensed school, and if we refused to do those 6, then we could be closed. So we agreed to do 3 and we refused to do 3. And then this led to the court case. Now, the court case, we had 3 judges, and we didn't know who the judges were going to be, I don't think. And we had a fantastic lawyer called Mark Stevens. And later on, we before the court case, but after we started sort of preparing for it, Mark Stevens managed to recruit for our barrister the great Geoffrey Robertson, who was an incredibly important human rights barrister. So, but the interesting thing about the court case, and in terms of its portrayal, which is quite interesting, by the children's BBC film and series called Summerhill, the judges, the 3 judges, give the court over to the children at the end. So what happens is that during the first 2 days, our barrister cross-examines the civil servant to do with overseeing inspections, and he doesn't do too well. In fact, one afternoon he's actually given homework, because he keeps on insisting in his response to our barrister that A.S. Neil, the founder of Summerhill, wrote as if he would encourage children to attend lessons. This was much to the gasp and surprise and horror of the A.S. Neil's daughter Zoe, and of our barrister and the solicitor, who knew A.S. Neil's writings quite well. So our barrister picked up one of A.S. Neil's books and said, "Well, show us where in this book A.S. Neil actually says that that children should be encouraged to go to lessons." And the Department for Education witness insisted there was something that Neil had written that did it, and the judges gave it for homework. For homework that evening, he had to research and prepare the statements that Neil had written or said that somehow he would encourage, or children should be encouraged to go to lessons. Anyway, one of the things about the judges was that a number of the times in the court case, they actually, in a sense, they took over from our barrister, especially when certain circumstances, like when the TBW, to be watched list, set of questions were raised, and the judges started sort of cross-examining the witness. And another time, there was the barrister for the Department for Education raises evidence reports about a young lad who was like a special needs special needs student, and that referenced the school's special attention list. Now, special attention list is a list that we have where every new child's on it, and then they simply get taken off it when we're confident that the children are making their own decisions, that they're autonomous and that they're able to make their own decisions about lessons, about learning. And they stay on it if we're a bit worried, and therefore we think we need to give them some kind of support, or if they're statemented and that they've been sort of diagnosed as special needs, then they're kept on the list. So this was a young lad, and he was on the list, and as a result there were written reports of him every term, and most of the reports were saying no action, no action, no action. And the DfE, Department for Education barrister, said this was clear evidence of the lack of the schools taking responsibility for the learning of its children. And our barrister got word from one of the adults in the court case by a handwritten note of who the student was and what was the background. But the actual barristers, not the barristers, the judges, then started cross-examining, and they said that that maybe, well, they concluded by saying that maybe it would be relevant for the Department for Education to actually look at the evidence of how the young boy was treated before he came to Summerhill, because he was one angry student at education, at teachers. He'd been measured and defined as special needs in different ways, and he was very, very sick of all this labelling. And when he arrived at our school, he had space to express this anger and to express himself in any way he liked, in a way, so long as he didn't harm people. And the reports, the judges recognised that our special attention reports actually confirmed that he was improving in terms of his sociability and in terms of his interactions and in terms of his engagement with the school, without actual interference or action by the staff. So the judges recognised the importance of living in Summerhill and how it works with children sometimes with severe special needs. In the children's BBC film, one of the things at the end is that the judges give the courtroom over to the children, and this surprises everyone. This even surprised the children, because the judges invited 3 children up, and these were children who were known chair people within our community, and they said, look, we give you the courtroom and you can then decide on whether that the community, the Summerhill community that was in the court, could then decide on whether to accept or not the agreements that were being offered to us by the Department for Education. So they sat them down in their chairs, and then they said to the room, they said, we've handed this room over to these 3 children, and now we're going to leave. So they left the courtroom at the back door, and the children sort of asked everyone who wasn't a Summerhillian, either ex-Summerhillian or student or staff, anyone who wasn't, should leave the room. And so they left the room. Some of them had to be encouraged. The Department for Education wondered what was going on. And also the journalist, there was one, I think either Daily Telegraph or Times journalist, was refusing to leave. He said, he hadn't, never been asked to leave a courtroom, especially asked to leave by children, and our solicitor had to go up to him and explain that the judges had given them control of the courtroom. So he very, very reluctantly sort of escorted out of the room. And then the children and the ex-students and the staff, including myself, stayed in the room, and we discussed what should happen next. And the first thing they discussed was, should all the visitors who weren't Summerhillians, all the people in the court, should they be allowed back in? And I was really angry. I mean, in terms of the way we've been treated by Ofsted and the Department for Education. So I spoke up, put my hand up, and I think Nathan was chairing it. He said, Michael, what do you have to say? And I said, well, I don't think we should allow them back in. Why should we? They're the ones that have deliberately distorted everything and have been bullying us, and I'm really angry with them, and I don't think we should let them in. They shouldn't have the honour of seeing us discuss or meet. And then other people spoke actually in favour. Most people spoke in favour of that we're proud of the meeting, and that we normally allow our visitors in to see what we're proud of. And they had a vote, and nearly everyone voted that the visitors should come in, and I voted against. And then they were allowed to come in. So the chair invited them back in, and they all came in, and then the community had its meeting, in which I think it's our solicitor read out, or the barrister read out the agreement document, and then the chair, Nathan, asked Zoe Redhead, the principal of Summerhill, what she thought, and she was crying, and she said, "I don't know. I honestly don't know whether this is a good agreement or not." And then it was discussed, and the solicitor was asked about, and there was a big discussion, and then the final vote was that we should accept the agreement. And then the judges came back in. Now, during this, because of the humour and some applause as well during the discussions, we actually had a clerk, I think, came into the room and just warned us that the noise made by the court had disturbed the courtroom next door. Anyway, that's one story about... the interesting thing is that when they reviewed, TV journalists reviewed the BBC film, the children's BBC film, one thing they said was totally unbelievable, was the idea that children would be allowed to take over a courtroom. Yes. Anyway, this is a book I picked up called Children's Courts, because I'm very interested in courts that are run by children, and I used to do workshops looking at using Summerhill and the Summerhill community meetings, getting state school children to sort of role play or reenact and using video clips from the Summerhill film and examples from cases that I'd seen within the Summerhill community, getting state school kids to think about what would they have done and how would they have voted. And I also looked at Janusz Korczak, who was a Polish, Jewish Polish guy who was very heroic. The UN sort of named the year of the child on the centenary, I think, of his birth. I think Janusz Korczak, and he set up orphanage in Warsaw in Poland. And it was an orphanage that was democratically run by the students and had a children's court. And he thought, Janusz thought, that every single school within 25 years or 50 years would have children's courts and would have some democratic participation, not only within the justice system but within the running of schools. Sadly, he was wrong. But... yeah, I mean, Janusz Korczak thought that children could only learn morality by living it. They could only learn values through creating them through active participations as citizens within the community, and that any other way of learning morality in terms of sets of rules that are defined by an authority called God or an authority called the head teacher or the government, that just learning of rules and laws was not a way to learn morality. Obedience, in fact, did not teach morality, because in a sense you could be taught to obey any set of laws, whether we see them as moral or not. Anyway, this book, Children's Courts, is written by a judge, and a man who was, I think, involved within the creation of the NSPCC, and his name's William Clark Hall, Sir William Clark Hall. He got knighted because of his work, and he was a judge at Shoreditch, I think, court. And he sort of specialises in children's courts. So he was a part of the establishment and a part of the new justice system that had come into being in the 1908 Children's Act that required the formation of courts specifically for children. Now listen to this. The purpose of the proceeding is not punishment but correction of conditions, care and protection of the child, and prevention of a recurrence of the event of the crime through the constructive work of the court. Under this theory, the court becomes a concrete expression of the state's obligation to the child, a recognition that the child is in court as a result of conditions not of his own or her own making, and that he has a valid claim against the state and is to be saved to it, not punished by it. So that's a quote from a book called Juvenile Courts and Probation, and it's about the system in America. So this view of child delinquency permeates all American ideas of probation and detention, and wholly eliminates mere punishment as an end in itself. Said, whilst admitting, however, that punishment which is merely retributive ought never to be meted out to children, it must be recognised that punishment may be, and if rightly administered, can be remedial. But the whole book is about children and judges actually making decisions using educational psychologists and making decisions with one-to-one in terms of the casework they do, with all the evidence of the backgrounds, the parenting, the social conditions, the psychological conditions of the child. And the decision is not one of punishment, but is one of trying to help the child in terms of reformation. Yeah? And it's a very interesting book because he starts at the beginning talking about schools and about prevention, and here's just one thing. If all children from bad homes would enjoy such advantages as those given by the Children's House at Bow, their capacity for future education would be greatly increased, and the task of their teachers enormously lightened, and the general standard of health raised. That's page 26. Yeah, Children's House was created by two sisters, the Lester sisters, Muriel and Doris Lester, who set up the settlement called Kingsley Hall, where Gandhi stayed. And Children's House is still open today, and I visited and met the head teacher and some of the children. One of the children showed me around, in fact, the school, which was wonderful. And it's it's called Children's House because it was set up in inspiration from the Montessori's work, and it's a state nursery school still. It was opened, I think, by H.G. Wells, and it was supported by George Lansbury, who helped. I think he was one of the people to lay the first bricks of the building, and it sort of dedicates itself to Tagore, the Bangladeshi or Indian Nobel Prize winning writer. And they got a wonderful mural in the classroom downstairs of children playing in the city, and then walking through a door in the wall to go into the countryside and playing into the countryside. So here is a judge who's written a book about justice, and he's saying that we need places like Children's House in order to have children brought up to have dignity and to have a sense of justice in terms of themselves and their communities. And he also goes on to say, on page 153, the Home Office has for many years shown a broad-minded interest in and desire to help any hopeful attempt by private persons to attain new and better ideals in the treatment of delinquent children. Yeah? In 1917, a certificate was granted by the Home Office. It was granted to the Little Commonwealth in Dorsetshire as a reformatory school. So in page 153, he talks about the Little Commonwealth, which was one of the inspirations for A.S. Neil Summerhill. A.S. Neil met Homer Lane, and they became close friends. And I think, Homer Lane became a therapist for A.S. Neil. But A.S. Neil saw the Little Commonwealth in action and was very, very impressed by how it worked and the relationship between Homer Lane and the students. It says that this experiment ended unfortunately, which it did, is very deeply to be regretted. The circumstances of its failure were, I think, due to no inherent defect in the fundamental principle underlying its creation. And it is earnestly to be hoped that in the near future an attempt may be made to establish a new school on similar lines, embodying the dual principles of self-discipline and co-education. Yeah. And then he goes on again in on page 162. He says at the end, he says, the principles of a little Commonwealth would form an excellent basis for the government of, and at least the higher class of school, if not of all schools. Here he's talking about certified schools. Yeah. And then he says, he criticises the certified schools in terms of this. Automatically they rise at the ringing of a bell. Like machines, they are set to allotted tasks, then all trooped into breakfast and begin the meal simultaneously after a solemn and sometimes lengthy grace has been said or sung. And so through all the day, with only some short interval at noon, the child in many a school becomes the victim of a routine that produces an admirably well-ordered, tidy, clean, smoothly working institution, but ignores the human individual, for whom, after all, the institution exists. Thus the child runs the risk of becoming a mere unthinking machine, with cramped and stunted soul. So strange and perverted indeed is the system, that from neither girls nor boys is any special energy or interest in their work demanded. And at the very end, he says, he actually writes a whole thing about as they might be. He looks at how children's courts and the treatment of children who are found to do offences, how what would the ideal situation be, and his summary point (27) of the talking about certified schools. Point 27 is more development of the principle of self-management by the inmates, as well as selected co-educational schools. Because one thing about Little Commonwealth, but because of the suffragettes, because during a Home Lane presentation before it was set up, I think it was Home Lane's presentation or one of the people setting up, they commented on the fact that it was only going to be set up originally, the Little Commonwealth for boys, as it had been in America, because the part of the Little Commonwealth was inspired by what they were doing in America. And America, in fact, had the first juvenile courts, children's courts, that were then created in England by the 1908 Act. So here we have this judge, William Clark Hall, Sir, becoming a Sir, recognised and celebrated as a judge by the establishment, who is seeing children's justice as one not of punishment but of reformation, that the problems that are causing the child to act delinquently are not genetic. He totally, at the beginning, he refutes Lombroso, who was a biologist, who claimed that, and there were a lot of others who claimed that criminality was inherited, that the criminality of our young children are because of poverty and violence and injustice within the family or within the social community. And I mean, it's interesting that the Homer Lane, who this man refers to in terms of the Little Commonwealth, Homer Lane, in his talks to the New Ideals in education, he was one of the, I think he spoke at least 3 of their conferences, and he spoke at their first conference in 1914. He tells the story about a boy who is brutalised through the justice and court system, and this boy is birched, which means that he is sort of publicly caned. He's beaten with a cane publicly as part of the punishment, but he's repeated Yeah, and Home Alone talks about this boy and how everything that's happening to him is reinforcing the boy's image of the community he's in, that it's a community that's brutalised him through poverty, it's brutalised him through hunger, it's maybe his parents or father hit him, and in terms of child labour and things, and then it's brutalising him through the justice system, and it's not in any sense trying to develop the beautiful aspects of humanity that would be that Home Alone and others saw within every child. Anyway, I mean, the other interesting thing is in terms of the reference to Bow Children's House in Bow, is the Lesser Sisters were part of a settlement movement, yeah, and they created their own settlement called Kingsley Hall, and there was also another settlement called Toynbee Hall, at which there was a purpose-built children's court for East London, and children from that court and children from Sir William Clark's Hall's court were sent to Little Commonwealth. So there's a lovely connection between East London and Home Alone and A.S. Neal and Summerhill School through the children of East London being the first residents of the Little Commonwealth, which was seen to be such a successful way of reforming children and regaining their humanity through them being active citizens within a democratic community in which they lived and worked. Now, the beginning of all this, you could say, was partly through, well, it was the settlements again, because not only did Toynbee Hall have a children's court, I mean, and it's also relevant that things like the children's theatre was created there, and various number of organisations to do with the rights of the child were created at Toynbee Hall, or within its buildings, but that the settlement movement was worldwide. It wasn't just in London, and the settlement movement was a sense of using, of creating buildings and community centres in which would live in very simple accommodation students from the universities who would bring with them their knowledge, their learning, their skills and everything, and they would have to live as equals, that's what the expectation was, within the working class community, and become members of it in a sense, and in doing so the idea was that they would learn from it, and the working class population would learn from them. And it was quite inspirational, because one of the things that inspired Janusz Korczak to set up his orphanage in Warsaw was visiting settlements in London. And also the settlement movement there was a Hull House settlement in Chicago, and the women's group in that settlement helped to set up one of the first children's courts, I think, in the world, which was Cook County Juvenile Court in 1899. And that court, in terms of its philosophy and things, was what good old William Clark Hall was referring to, in terms of not punishing the child, but in terms of probation, and in terms of using probation and the actions of the court in terms of the decisions the judges made for how the children should be treated, as ones that try and solve the situation and try and reform the child and not to punish the child. And this is the women of Hull House settlement in Chicago. So I think there's an incredible link between the settlement movement and the progressive education movement, and Home Alone and Summerhill School, but in general. And there's also this sense that we have of zero tolerance now, and the authoritarian system of punishment, in terms of you punishing, and it's a question of how serious the punishment is, how long it is, and things like that. And we seem to have lost that philosophy and values in terms of at least the public and the public debate nowadays of what's the point of justice. Yeah, which was seen in the 1890s and early 1900s and 1917, and during the war as well, First World War, of children and a crime, delinquent crime, being a consequence of lack of play, lack of dignity, lack of entertainment, lack of culture, lack of care, lack of protection, and in a sense a lack of childhood. Yeah. I think we can end there. There's a lot more I could tell in terms of stories and things. I was going to tell some stories to do with Janusz Korczak in his court, but I think that's enough. So, object 22 was the gavel, and I hope you get some starting points for thinking about the Summerhill School and its tribunals, and the fact that the community, that all the children and the adults vote and make decisions about justice, and how this reflects the work of Korczak and also Homer Lane, but then also the courts, the actual criminal courts of London and Chicago and elsewhere in terms of how they treated the child. I mean, another interesting thing, just before I go, was one of the things they considered seriously was not labelling the child a criminal, not giving them a criminal record, because they recognised that once you've got a criminal record, then that's going to define you for the rest of your life, and that children, at least people under 18, should not be defined by their misdemeanours as children, and that they should be, that society has a responsibility for helping them to become human beings that can enjoy life, can be creative, and have dignity and respect for themselves and others. Thank you very much indeed.